Good morning again, and welcome to St. Peter the Apostle Anglican Church as we continue our series on what is Anglicanism. This morning what we're going to do is we're going to look at some of the key Protestant reformers, not the usual ones with which everyone is familiar. We've talked about Cranmer a little bit, we've talked about Thomas Cromwell, we've talked about William Tyndale, mentioned Anne Boleyn, and there are others. But for this morning, I want to talk about two of the truly significant Protestant reformers in the English Reformation, and how do I want to put it? Their far-reaching influence on the English Church. We will have to break this up. Next week we'll look at Hugh Latimer and Nicholas Ridley. But what I wanted to do was focus on those truly significant individuals that don't often get as much attention as Cranmer and Tyndale and Wycliffe. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do it a little bit out of order. I'm going to start with Matthew Parker this morning. Parker was truly one of the significant influences in the Protestant Reformation, as he served as the Archbishop of Canterbury. He served under Elizabeth. His impact on the English Reformation cannot be overstated, even though we usually don't hear a lot about him. He was born in Norwich, Norwich, in 1504. He studied, of course, at Cambridge, which was becoming the Protestant hotbed. He went to Corpus Christi College. He became a fellow, and it was there in Cambridge where he started to develop his emerging infatuation with the Protestant movement and the Reformation as it came over from the continent. He was ordained a priest in 1527. He served as chaplain to Anne Boleyn, who of course was Elizabeth's mother. And this would then give some insight as to how Anne became so enamored with the Lutheran position. This connection to Anne aided in his position and reputation with Elizabeth and his appointment to the archbishopric. When Mary took the throne back in 1553, for the next 5 years, he basically kept his powder dry and his head down. And he lived quietly and did everything that he could to avoid persecution, since he not only was a committed Protestant, he made no bones about it. Queen Elizabeth appointed him as the Archbishop of Canterbury in 1559, just a few short months after her accession to the throne. And we always talk about the Elizabethan settlement and what occurred within the reign of Elizabeth. Well, we're looking at one of the key figures in the development of the Elizabethan settlement, Matthew Parker. And if you look at the Elizabethan settlement, you can see how significant Parker's influence is, because the Elizabethan settlement essentially establishes the identity of the English Church throughout history, at least from the 16th century onward. So when you talk about Matthew Parker, you're talking about the guy that essentially provided the structure and framework for what became known as the Elizabethan settlement and the Church of England. We know that Cranmer started on the Articles of Religion, and it was Parker that actually sharpened them and was influential in reducing them from 42 to the 39 articles that we have now. And no matter how you look at the 39 Articles, and this is what creates such tension today within the continuing movement, the 39 Articles are structurally and theologically Protestant. There's no way that anybody who looks at them objectively can deny that they are overtly Protestant. And we can have debates as to which flavor of Protestant they may be, whether they're more Lutheran or more Calvin Reformed, but the fact of the matter is they are largely an expression of Protestant theology. And we briefly mentioned it, but it's important to keep in mind that the 39 Articles essentially function as a corrective to extremes. They are reacting on the one hand to the extremes and the accretions that occurred during the Middle Ages within Rome, and then they're also responding to the Anabaptists and the rejection of the sacraments. So it falls very much in the tradition of the Catholic Church, just not the Roman Church. And this is one of the, and he's also noted for one of the more disputed phrases of this time period, something that we constantly refer to as the via media, the middle road or the middle way. Now, that's not disputed. I mean, he was influential in coming up with that. The question is, which iteration, which definition of the middle way, of the via media, can we ascribe to him, and to what do we ascribe? Are we talking about a middle way between Rome and Protestantism? Or are we talking about a middle way between Geneva and Wittenberg? So I'll leave that up to your reading and research to determine. I know where I stand. But it is an interesting question, because it was Matthew Parker that put that in motion. He was a passionate scholar, and he was an avid antiquarian. As a matter of fact, how many people have heard of the Parker Society? Matthew Parker lended his name to the Parker Society, which would collect important manuscripts throughout church history, specifically in relationship to the Church of England. And Parker himself, was very instrumental in protecting and preserving and finding a lot of Anglo-Saxon manuscripts. The collection of his library, which is in Corpus Christi College, Cambridge, is called the Parker Library, or the Parker Collection. And it is still considered one of the most important collections of medieval manuscripts in the entire world, to give you some idea as to how important his scholarship and research was. As the Archbishop, he was instrumental in promoting education and biblical scholarship, and he supported the production of the Bishop's Bible in 1568. Anybody know what the Bishop's Bible is? All right, at this point, the Church of England had two versions. They had the Great Bible, which was printed in 1538, and the Geneva Bible in 1560. The Geneva Bible was thoroughgoingly reformed in its theology, and by that I mean it was Calvinistic. Now, it doesn't come through in the text. The text is the text is the text. But when you look at the footnotes of the Geneva Bible, the footnotes are thoroughly reformed. this created a problem with all of the bishops, because the bishops were high churchmen, as it was understood at this time in the 16th century, and they did not support Calvin and the Reformed understanding of theology, which is interesting because the majority of clergy at this time actually did support Calvin. They disagreed with him on polity. They weren't Presbyterian, but they actually sided with him theologically. So this created some tension. The difficulty was the Great Bible was the only Bible that was authorized within England. So something had to be done. They couldn't move to the Geneva Bible. So Matthew Parker came up with the idea of let's look at another translation, because the Great Bible primarily focused on the Vulgate. And he wanted to go back, Ad Fontes, he wanted to go back to the Hebrew and the Aramaic and the Greek, of course. So that's what he does. They produce what's called the Bishop's Bible, which was acceptable to the majority of the episcopate. And the Bishop's Bible becomes, through at least two iterations, the foundation for the King James in 1611. Parker ministered diligently. He was a long-term ally and confidant of Elizabeth, and he was buried in Lambeth Palace when he died in 1575. He was one of those individuals who, in death, didn't escape the English Civil War, because during the English Civil War, his tomb was, let's just say his tomb was disturbed. Now, a more controversial figure, and unfortunately somebody we still deal with today, was John Hooper. Hooper was born in 1495 in Somerset. He got his BA from Merton College in Oxford in 1519. Now you would think, oh, he went to Oxford, that would mean he's probably leaning towards the more Anglo-Catholic position. Au contraire. He initially entered the monastic life. There's speculation as to which order, probably a Cistercian. But he left after becoming influenced by Luther and Lutheran writings, and Zwinglian and Bullingerian, or Bullinger, their theology. He fled England during Henry VIII's 6 Articles enforcement, and he traveled through France, Holland, and Switzerland, and wound up creating alliances and forming long-term bonds with some of the continental reformers, not the least of which was Heinrich Bullinger himself. When Edward VI became the king in 1549, Hooper saw this as an opportunity to return to England safely, as Edward VI was, without question, an overtly Protestant king. And of course, there's always the what-if speculations when it comes to Edward and the Church of England. What if Edward didn't die when he was 16 years old? Hooper received the bishopric of Gloucester around 1550, and here's where he becomes one of those people that when we talk of him, depending upon who is speaking of him, will determine the tone of your voice when you talk about Hooper. He publicly opposed wearing traditional vestments. He opposed swearing to the saints, which he deemed both unscriptural vestiges of Rome. When you see low churchmen, men, well, I won't name names, but there are a lot of people today that you will see, and they will conduct Mass, in cassock, surplice, white surplice, and the black stole tippet. That is Hooper's legacy. I'll get to it in a minute. I'm not going to jump ahead. He was immediately arrested. Immediately. But he lived under house arrest and eventually being imprisoned. However, he finally relented, holding it down the entire time, so that he could preach. He was consecrated a bishop on March 8th in 1551. So it took the better part of a year to convince him to actually attire himself appropriately. He was, by all standards, an active archbishop. He visited parishes all the time. He checked with, he had under him at this time 311 clergy, and he checked with each and every one of them. He was a pastor's pastor, without a doubt. Whether you agree with him as to his theological proclivities, he understood the importance of a shepherd shepherding his sheep. When he checked with his clergy, he found that more than half, over 155 of his clergy, could not recite the Ten Commandments. And then he required, after this, that all clergy, which of course would then extend down to the parishioners, would be trained in doctrinal precision. And when I mean doctrinal precision, I mean down to the exact wording. No skipping the these, the a's, the ahs, the ohs. He wanted, you knew every single word of the text. You knew every single word of what you were supposed to be responsible. In 1552, an interesting year, Gloucester, the Diocese of Gloucester, merged with the Diocese of Worcester, and he became the bishop of both. He was, it's funny when you read historians and they use terms like he influenced. A better word would be he browbeat people in liturgical development, and he was a prominent contributing influence to the 1552 Book of Common Prayer. He advocated positions that later became known as Puritanism. And as the Puritans would ultimately find themselves more closely affiliated with the Presbyterians, it was his teaching that laid the foundation for what we now know as the Presbyterian regulative form of worship. You only do that which Scripture explicitly commands, or by reasonable inference and scriptural deduction can be found within Scripture. to not do anything else, according to Hooper. Why is 1552 significant? How familiar are we with the prayer book? It is the second iteration of the Book of Common Prayer. And it was Protestant. Purely Protestant. When we say, when I'm distributing the elements, the body of Christ, which is given for you, right? Preserve your body and soul into everlasting life. Take this in remembrance that Christ died for you, and feed on him in your heart by faith with thanksgiving. That last clause, Christ died for you, feed on him, and that was what Hooper was involved with developing in the liturgy of the 1552. The first part came from the 1549, and as you know today, when we do morning prayer, the first part came from the 1549, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah, 1549. So as you listen to the words of consecration, the celebration of the Eucharist, you'll notice that both clauses are included. That was part of Matthew Parker's Elizabethan compromise in the Elizabethan settlement. They took the first clause from the 1549, they took the second clause from the 1552, and voila, welcome to the Anglican methodology of everything. Everybody's part of the party. Later, when Mary restores the crown to Rome, he opposed Northumberland's coup and was immediately imprisoned. And by most accounts, the charges of heresy were kind of sketchy. He was just one of those people that, like to poke you in the eye, but there was nothing untoward about what he was teaching at the time. He was stripped of his offices in 1554, ironically, for being a married bishop. And then he was condemned, and he was accused under the heresy statutes in 1555 as Mary resurrected the heresy statutes. His influence cannot be overstated. He was a leading Puritan for his uncompromising adherence to Scripture in worship and doctrine, the regulative principle. He was, whether you consider him obstreperous as you read what he was doing, he was a very, very brave individual. He stood his ground. Clergy literacy, at least during the time of the Reformation, can be linked back to him because of his insistence on clergy being educated. Especially the Ten Commandments, which makes sense if you understand Puritanism. His influence also extends significantly to shaping early, and let me emphasize, early Anglican identity. And this goes to the entire focus of what we've been talking about. How you define Anglicanism is going to be determined depending upon what historical time period you are addressing. That Anglicanism has historically lived in tension. And we still have that today. Different tension, but we still have that tension within the C of E. His writings, his sermons, his tracts, and his declaration of the Ten Commandments remain included in many many Reformed and Anglican studies. He was quite the scholar and influencer. All right, that's what I want to do for now. Unless you want me to blast through and try to get to Latimer.
I have a question, just.
All right, so then that's.
And Mike.
Sure.
So when talking about Cooper and the Ten Commandments,
Yeah.
was the Decalogue always part of the Book of Common Prayer, or did
Yes.
he influence that?
No, the Decalogue was the allegedly the foundation for all liturgy is the Sarum Missal. And that comes from, I'm trying to remember, I know it's in the Middle Ages, I don't remember the exact date, I think it's like the 11th or 12th century, it's very early. The closest that you can, the closest you'll come, from my recollection, to the Sarum is the 1549 Book of Common Prayer. And there are differences in the 1549. When you look at the 1552 and the 1559, the changes that took place, and this is this is a lecture for another course, but the changes that took place are significantly influenced by Martin Bucer, the French reformer from Strasbourg, French/German, because he was in Strasbourg, and at that time the border for Strasbourg was written in Etch-a-Sketch, depending upon who was, which throne was in power. When you look at the 1549, and if you go to certain Anglo-Catholic churches, you'll see the Gloria, which we say at the end of the service. The Gloria comes at the beginning, right after the Kyrie. There are prayers in the prayer for the state of the church. There's a paragraph in the middle, and if you go to the Missal, it's in the Missal that prays for those in purgatory. Bucer looked at this, and at the behest of Cranmer, came over to England. I think I told you, I think I mentioned that Cranmer wanted to put together a full Protestant synod. He wanted to have a full council. And Bucer was one of the people that he wanted to attend. Peter Martyr Vermilion was another one, John Alaska. I wish I had the time to go into all these guys, but I don't. As a matter of fact, if I remember right, I think it was Edward, wanted to make Alaska a bishop so that he could be in line to be the Archbishop of Canterbury. Alaska, who was a Pole, declined because he saw the importance of his ministry with the Polish community in England, because they had no one. But all that to say that Bucer wrote a treatment, and I won't give it a long Latin title, but he wrote this treatment, and it was at the behest of Cranmer to evaluate the Book of Common Prayer. And he came up with 50, depending upon how you break down some of his critiques, he came up with 51 suggestions to alter the 1549 Book of Common Prayer. Of those 51, somewhere between, again, depending upon how you break down the wording, 26 to 28 were implemented. Half of what we have today in the Book of Common Prayer is a result of Martin Bucer's critique. And you'll see eliminations in the 28 that are in the Missal. The Missal represents the Sarum. It represents what we would have identified as the 1549 in the Roman Missal. It matched very nicely. Butcher saw that and said, we've got to change this, this needs to be corrected. He provided his emendations to Cranmer. Cranmer implemented a number of them. As you can imagine, Butcher was, of course, against episcopacy. He opposed vestments and those things. So Cranmer wasn't just enamored with the man. And if anybody ever has any interest, we'll go through Martin Butcher, because, as I mentioned before, if there was anything going on anywhere where somebody of note was present, Butcher was there. And he knew it.
His last name?
The German spelling is B-U-T-Z-E-R. That's the German. The anglicized is B-U-C-E-R. First name Martin. That's why you'll hear a lot of us when we talk about him, we'll say Butcher. And it's like, well, where's the T? It's in German. Or in a cup on the table. But the Ten Commandments, a place for confession, a place for absolution, all of these were influenced by Martin Butcher. Yes. Yes.
Oh, I have a quick question back to the Via Media.
Mm-hmm.
You were speaking about Rome and Protestantism and somebody in Wittenberg,
Geneva.
Geneva.
The argument goes back and forth whether or not Anglicanism, as, again, how you define it based on the historical period in which you're looking, is Anglicanism a middle way, a middle ground between Rome and Protestantism? Why would they say that? Well, look at the liturgy. There isn't a Roman Catholic that could go to a high church, let's just say high church, however we're defining that. They could go to a high church Anglican service and they would feel very much at home. We've had a number of Roman Catholics come through here. And in every conversation I've ever had, I always ask them the same question. So what do you think? Any issues? And they all say the same thing. No, it's pretty much what we do. So what winds up developing out of that is an idea that, oh, well, we have Roman Catholic liturgy, but then we got this thing called the Articles of Religion, the 39 Articles, that are avowedly Protestant in the Book of Common Prayer, and were at one time required. I've had to, when I was ordained a priest, I had to subscribe. It's the subscription clause. I had to subscribe to the 39 Articles being a confessional document, which I still believe it's a confessional document. So there you have this tension between, oh, well, we're between this and we're between that, all right? We're between Rome and we're between Protestantism. Others will argue, and I will say that I believe this is more accurate, that once Cranmer got his hands on the reins of the English Reformation, and then all of these other players come into view, and there are many. I haven't mentioned John Fox. I haven't mentioned Thomas Bilney. There is a whole slew of people that are very much a part of creating the identity of Anglicanism during this time period. But when you look at the Church of England and you recognize that Henry was Roman Catholic and always was going to be Roman Catholic, his break from Rome was simply, let's say he was dissatisfied. He thought there was favoritism with other people, getting divorces where he didn't get a divorce because the Queen was related to Charles V, it was her nephew, and he was pouting. So I'm going to take my marbles and go over here, but I'm still going to be Roman Catholic. But when he was out of the picture, things changed drastically. There was a movement underneath while he was still alive where a lot of the English reformers had to be very careful. They had to watch what they said and how they framed it when they were talking about their reforms in the church. And one of the things that comes to the fore in this sequence of historical events is that the men involved in the reforms would pick up on things that Henry wanted or that Henry agreed with, and in a sense they would do what Congress does today. Oh, you want this? Well, we're going to put 50 riders on it. So when these gentlemen start to implement what Henry wanted, taking money from monasteries, they would then subtly, and sometimes not so subtly, but they would subtly suggest other reforms that were Protestant in nature. So there was an undercurrent, almost a subversive that's a bad way, group of individuals that were moving the Protestant Reformation along incrementally, keeping their head down until Henry died, and then when Henry died, boom. Now we have a full-blown Protestant identity. And when you combine the fact that Matthew Parker influenced Elizabeth, and Parker was a thoroughgoing Protestant, and you combine that with Hooper and his influence on polity and liturgy, the question that has to be asked, is it legitimate to isolate the Via Media to Rome versus Protestantism? Or is it now not more accurately whether or not one is going to be Lutheran in their understanding of the confessional document, 39 Articles, which defines Anglicanism to a degree, or are you going to look at the 39 Articles as being Reformed or Calvinistic? So this is where the question arises when we talk about the Via Media. Is it Roman or is it Protestant? Or is it Lutheran or is it Reformed? So I don't think that's going to get resolved in our lifetime, to be honest. I just don't. It's just one of those questions that is constantly bantered about. I think there's a sufficient case to be made that the Via Media actually is between Wittenberg and Geneva, especially when you consider Cranmer's relationship to Lutheranism. He was married to Osiander's niece. And Osiander was a powerful Lutheran influence on the continent. So, does that answer the question? Okay. Yeah, I always kind of cringe when I hear the Via Media between Protestant and Roman Catholic. Not really. Not really. Because as I said, subscription was required and the 39 Articles were thoroughly Protestant. You can't argue that. And if the confessional document of the church is defining what the church is and what is to be done in this particular church, then Geneva and Wittenberg become the odds-on favorite as to who's steering the ship between what.
When we get to the point in this study of the Book of Common Prayer, will we go over the 39 articles more in depth?
No, we will look at the 39 articles. No, because to go over the 39 articles,
That's a whole separate.
you have to give the history, you have to give the background, and for it to be properly understood. We'll look at the 39 articles. We'll do what is traditionally done when people look at the 39 articles. We'll look at the prominent elements, Articles 9 through 16 of the sacraments. We'll look at 17 and 18, election and predestination. These are the ones that everybody gets all bent out of shape over. But yeah, but we won't go line by line. I mean, we can do that at some point in the future, but I don't see it being possible now. No, what are you going to concentrate on? And it'll actually be a couple of weeks, because next week we'll do Latimer and Ridley. After that, we'll briefly look at the Elizabethan settlement and then the Oxford movement. So we're going to be jumping a vast historical period. And once we're done with the Oxford movement, then we're going to the Book of Common Prayer. We're going upstairs. I'm not going to talk about the modern state of the church because I don't need to. What we got to do is look at it. So, okay.
So you mentioned the Bishop's Bible and how there was that split basically between the bishops and the
clergy.
Yeah, the larger body of the clergy being more reformed.
Yeah.
And that had, I was wondering, I was thinking about this, like, it seems like, I'm not sure exactly why, but it seems like there is a correlation between being more reformed and being more low church, or or being high church and being more like Arminian or something. And I'm wondering why you think that might be the case.
Well, let's see, how can I do this in 2 minutes? The reform aspect of the 39 articles, it was the 39 articles you were referring to in reference, oh no, Bishop Bible. The reformed aspect is, in reference to this discussion, is primarily problematic when it comes to polity, because of Presbyterianism. And when you look at how the Reformed understand not only the Scripture, but when they understand polity and they understand worship, it's very much, I think, and erroneously, linked to a more Presbyterian, I hate using the term, a more elder concept of how the church should be structured and function. Well, if you function in that way, then what that will subsequently lead to, it's not an immediate direct cause and effect, but what that will subsequently lead to is a de jure form of church government. And if it's a de jure, divine right form of church government, that would seem to fit more seamlessly with the Presbyterian, with the Reformed concept of God's sovereignty. So when the Reformed camp comes to this and they look at this is all one big cohesive and coherent system that is applied, where God is sovereign and everything stems out of God's sovereignty. The misapplication of this is most people equate sovereignty with predestination, and that is not accurate. God's sovereignty, simply stated, is He has the ability, the power, the control, and the right over all of his creation. And we're part of that.
It's omnipotence.
It's all of it. So the Reformed coming to this, especially the clergy at this time, remember, they don't have, there's poverty, there's tension amongst the culture, farmers are having problems, there's no money, all of these things are taking place at this time. And the Reformed guys come in and say, God is in control, we need to focus on how he sovereignly is working out all of these things, and part of the working out of this is all pointing to and contributing to his redemptive work in the church. On the other hand, when you look at the, I'll use the term high church and just leave it open like that, that's more governmental structure, that's more monarchical, so it's a top-down mentality. And the way that, and this is a gross oversimplification, so take it for what it's worth, but the way that you wind up interacting in that is that, well, I'm the grand poobah, and you guys are peasants, literally and figuratively, and I'm just going to be kind of hands-off as long as you're doing what you're supposed to be doing. As long as you're tithing for me and going to battle for me, I don't care. So what happens? Well, now there's very minimal personal direct influence, and your constituent culture looks to work things out on their own. And that's what contributes to a facilitation and an enamoring of, with Arminian theology. And again, gross oversimplification. So, but that gives you kind of a framework as to why it plays out the way. All right, we're 5 after, so let us stop now. We'll talk about Latimer and Ridley next week. And then we'll be almost done with the historical portion.